Listen, first of all, thanks to all of you who have hung in here with us and are still here at the last panel on Halloween. We thought to make it more entertaining, maybe we should have come in costume, but discretion's the better part of judgment. So we didn't. We have what we call our Capstone Panel, and the effort's going to be not really to summarize what's gone on, but to kind of take the theme of the conference, which is energy transition in the 21st century, and talk about it from three different perspectives that needed to be represented here at the conference. And so to my immediate left is David Eves. You've met him. You've met a couple of folks from Excel. But David is the CEO of Colorado Excel, also called the Public Service Company of Colorado. Rose McKinney-James is now a private consultant, but I've known Rose for a long time. She was a utility commissioner in Nevada in the 90s. Rose and I serve together on the Energy Foundation Board, and she's back on the Energy Foundation Board, but she also is on the board of MGM Grand. If you follow things happening in Nevada, she's got an interesting story to tell about MGM Grand and their utility, NV Energy. And Dan Arvizu, I first met when I was a candidate for governor, went out to NREL just to talk to him about energy issues, and he was the director at NREL. He left, when did you leave NREL? December 2015, so not quite 2 years ago. And Dan is an advisor to Steve Jobs' widow and to her foundation on a variety of fronts. Splits his time between California and Colorado, but was in the national lab system for a very long time and rose to the place of being a director of NREL, which among labs in the United States is a prestigious position, and did a lot of fantastic work at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to just try and have this as much a conversation as we can. And we started early so we could end early, and then they gave us extra time on the clock, I saw. So we may not go all the way to the very end there. But here's the deal, David. You're the CEO of a utility. There's been a lot of conversations about transition in the West. You have been at Excel, I think you said today, since 2009, or you've been the CEO back here, but you've got some experience in this 30-some years, 34 years. Look back and just talk a little bit about transitions looking back, but the speed of this transition now that we're experienced, it really has to do with fuel use in part, but also in things like distributed generation and customer preference.
Yeah, I look at two or three things that tell me, I mean, this is happening. It's happening faster and faster. It's here. I can't predict exactly how it's going to happen, but first off, I'm sure that a lot of you have been here for the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years. This is very different than it was 5 years ago in terms of the scope of the technological change, what's happening across the world, and you just look at the numbers. You look at Mid-American's numbers. You look at what we're trying to do with renewables, that we could get to 55% by 7 years from now. I never would have thought that was possible. So the pace of change is very evident that it's happening. Second, it's economic. We've talked about it a lot yesterday and today. And I think 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's really been about how much cost difference there was, what do renewable energy standards cost, are customers willing to pay more? These choices are in the money now, and I think that dramatically changes the whole game. You have to be smart about how to do it, how to retire coal and bring renewables on and use the transmission and make all that happen and take care of the communities that are affected. But I think the economics make a big difference. The final thing I see happening is that, and Rose can probably talk about this more, but particularly in the last 9 months, our customers and even whole communities are standing up and want to take matters into their own hand. They want to plan their energy future. They want to affect the way we serve them. And it's not just moving from kilowatt hours to services. That's part of it. But part of it is, I mean, they've decided that the lack of federal plans to move where they believe we need to move, and we will take matters into our own hands and do it. And it's not just Boulder. It's many, many communities, large cities that are coming to us, and if we can't find a way to respond, they're going to go around us. They're going to do it anyway. And I think that force is very strong to have cities like Denver, to have very, very large energy-using customers, to have virtually, increasing every month. More and more of our national account customers are focused on this. How can you get us more renewables? And they're open to customer-sited, distributed, they're open to community projects, but they also want to look at microgrids, they want grid-scale, low-cost solar. It's here, so.
Thanks. Rose, it's a great segue. And I think you should talk a little bit about your story, because it's such a fascinating thing to have been a commissioner in the sort of 90s when the pace of change I just perceive as having been slower at the time, and watching it speed up and really being involved in a lot of things, but particularly in Nevada with MGM Grand as a board member, and with NV Energy and with the customer choice, the energy choice initiative that was on the ballot. This is part of this transition that David was referencing.
It really is indeed. Am I on? No. I don't feel like I'm on.
You gotta push your button and then I'll turn on.
Push the button. Push the button. It's green now.
There you go.
Green is good. So first off, thank you very much, Governor, for having me here. I think Nevada and Colorado have a great deal in common. This is my first trip to Fort Collins, and I've been delighted with the couple of days that I've been here. You all promote, well, I guess we both promote tourism. Tourism is huge. Your recreation is outdoors. Ours tends to be indoors. But as the governor mentioned, as a utility commissioner, as I recall all those years ago, much of what I did was to take a look back at 30-year coal contracts. We did initiate integrated resource planning in Nevada very early, and so we began a process where we were attempting to, I think, be more comprehensive around how we dealt with the regulatory environment. But it's changed in light years. I was very interested in Chairman Ackerman's overview today, but even what he put on the screen suggests to me that the pace that you will see and that we need to see in the regulatory environment is still relatively slow. So with respect to, and it's actually MGM Resorts International, we're a Fortune 500 company. We have 11 properties on the Strip in Las Vegas. We are in 7 states. We're also in China. We are a huge company. We are the largest employer in Nevada, the largest taxpayer in Nevada, and as a result, the leadership that we attempt to display is important. I am a member of the board of directors. I chair the committee for corporate social responsibility, which includes sustainability. And a couple of years ago, we simply found that we did not believe we were achieving the goals that we'd established for ourselves. And we made a decision to look at a provision in the state statute that allowed us to exit the system. And we did, in fact, exit. We did the exit. We paid a fairly substantial fee to do that, but it gave us the flexibility to identify independent professionals to help us procure our own energy because we wanted more renewables. And we wanted the flexibility to do it ourselves. And we felt as business leaders that we had the capacity to make those decisions on our own. So you also mentioned the Ballot Initiative. That passed by 72%. And the initiative essentially says that Nevada will become a choice state. It's a constitutional change, so it requires 2 cycles on the ballot. We expect that it will pass again with a robust majority next year. So there's a lot going on in Nevada. We believe that we boast, I enjoyed the governor's kibitzing about their wind resource. We have a ton of solar in Nevada. We also have a ton of geothermal in Nevada. And those resources, in our minds, and I believe it's the same in Colorado, translate to economic development potential, to jobs and all of the multipliers that come along with truly advancing the clean energy economy, and not to lose sight of energy efficiency as well. So yes, we have been very actively engaged. When MGM left, Wynn followed, Caesars followed, so the gaming industry has been very active. Also, our largest data center followed, and those filings created a schism within the commission. They are required now to be far more nimble in determining what the structure is going to look like, because customers are leading the charge.
Just as a follow-on to that, Microsoft did something very similar with Puget Sound Energy. So that was their utility provider in the state of Washington. They paid to exit the system and pay for the non-depreciated assets, you know, so that they can buy their power on an independent market. And so I think it's not just a one-off that MGM International did that, but something that utilities, and we'll come back to you, David. I want to go to Dan, but we'll come back to you and have you kind of talk about how it feels with this other thing out there with corporate purchasing. So Dan, the thesis in part in this conference is that, you know, there's a lot happening at the federal level. Feels like it's a pushback against things that were happening to try and promote clean energy and climate work. But states, cities, corporations have their own momentum. I want you to address the part that we've touched on at different times here about technology. When you were at NREL, you guys released a report saying we could have 80% renewables by 2050 with very little change in technology, just some upgrading, serious upgrading in the transmission grid. What role do you see technology still is playing in this transition? And as kind of a part of that, what role does finance play in developing and in curating technology?
Great. Let me get into that in a little bit more detail, but start with a little bit of a historical perspective. So I've had both the honor and the privilege and somewhat frustration of being in the R&D of renewable energy now for a little bit more than 4 decades. So as I recall back the role that technology played back then and the role that technology can still play today, things are obviously very different. I do recall I was actually working at Bell Labs in the mid-'70s and had the opportunity to go and essentially start solar programs at Sandia National Labs, which at the time was run by AT&T as the contractor that ran that particular national security laboratory. Photovoltaic devices at that time were 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. That's what we had in terms of the technology. Wind turbines were, the largest one we had was 1.8 meters. Okay, that's like less than 6 feet. And to contrast that with what we have today, the deployment of 1 gigawatt of photovoltaics, of wind turbines, these massive mechanical machineries, and I'm a mechanical engineer, so these are still, I'm awestruck when I see how do these things actually work. I mean, they're enormous. That technology development has happened over many, many years. In energy, like politics and a variety of other things, is both local and it's cyclic. And I think what I've learned over those many, many years is that there are times when there's great advancing, and I'll call it innovation, that's occurring in various sectors of things. And then there's times when there's kind of lull periods or maybe more plateau periods. And we continue to do that in a very cyclic sort of way. Technology is still as important today as it was back in the early days. That's the first answer to the question, Governor, that you asked. And second of all, it's really, and I like to say this affectionately, it's always about the money. All right? It is about finance, it is about deployment of capital, and it is about markets working efficiently and effectively. And policy is a big piece of that because the energy industry is a highly regulated industry. I also serve on the board of directors of a major insurance company, which is a regulated industry, I might add. And so much of how you deploy capital is really about risk and risk management. That's really what it's about. So the technology can play a role. It tends to de-risk the investments that people make. But there is this other somewhat complex environment that we live in, which has to do with what is our public posture, what is our public, what are the objectives that we have as a society in terms of supplying energy to all of the consumers. So I'll start with, I'll end very quickly here, but I wanted to make a couple of points. First point is, what I see today is that we have come a long way. There is plenty to be very proud of. There was a time back in the early days when there were folks who would say, that solar energy stuff or that wind stuff will never make a difference. It will never, in any form or fashion, be a part of our energy mix. Okay, I recall those discussions vividly. Not too many people still advocating those kinds of things. But and at the laboratory, we spent a lot of time on figuring out are the resources there? And what we've determined are the resources are there. We've got plenty of resources. That's not the issue. Technology can actually capture those resources in a way that we can generate electricity that we want to. The more challenging part is how do we essentially integrate the technologies of alternatives or renewable energies into the existing infrastructure that we have. And that's very different in OECD nations or in the US versus emerging economies. Those are two very different issues, and they will probably require different solutions with different mixes. So you need to tailor that. That's kind of the key point there. What I will say in terms of now where we are today relative to all the progress that we've made is we still have a lot to do. To get to where low carbon technologies are consequential in our energy mix globally, we've got a long way to go. And that long way to go has a mix of technology, markets, and policy. And I think one of the things that's required is that we change the narrative. For those of us in the technology world, technology and science can solve almost anything. The problem that we have with it is that it's not equitable. And so one of the things that I'm doing for Emerson Collective these days is looking at it from the perspective of what lens should we apply to how we develop technology and invest in technology, and what should our public policy look like in order to actually pull all the benefits of that technology development forward. And so we like to talk about technology now as humanitech, technology in the service of humanity. It's maybe a great thing that those of us in Palo Alto can be driving Teslas, and that's a wonderful thing, and we're low carbon, yada, yada, yada. But for the masses that have to deal with energy and the energy infrastructure, they don't see that. They don't have the opportunity. They don't benefit from that. So we need to be thinking about our public policy and about our markets and about our technology in the context of social equity and the things that ultimately will drive us to a different sort of motivation in terms of public finance and in terms of policy. And I think that's where an interesting part of the conversation we need to turn as we think about the transition going forward. I think we should be proud of where we are today. It's totally insufficient to where we need to be. And ultimately, I think we've got lots of opportunity if we take some of the lessons that we've learned in the last 4 decades and apply those going forward.
Can I follow on just a
You
little
bet.
bit? First off, I saw a young woman yesterday in a shirt from Grid Alternatives, and I always want to give a shout out to that organization because, to your point, when you find a focus that is on allowing people to take advantage of these technologies in their communities, where there is training, where there is, at the local level, a focus, you've got good stuff, and I'm a big fan of Grid Alternatives. So I started sort of a conundrum, trained as a lawyer, regulator, cabinet secretary, lots of different things in Nevada, but ultimately what I became was an advocate for renewable energy and energy efficiency. And it seemed to me that most of the work that we did was sort of a field of dreams approach. Field of dreams, build it and they will come. I promise you, the cost of solar is going to come down, but we have to make an investment somewhere. People would roll their eyes. It's never going to come down. We were constantly dealing with barriers. So today, as you fast forward to the conversations that we're having, where you can barely keep pace, where you have voters who are willing to go to the ballot box and say, oh, yes, you can, yes, you will, and it is here, that is just a huge transition from where I began all those years ago. And I think it needs to be noted that that's the case. I'm not sure we can keep up with the consumer desire. I think that's a real challenge for you, David, because you are in a regulated environment, and so regulators have to come some distance, and investor-owned utilities need to make some adjustments too. So I mean, I think it's important.
I totally agree. Because there's obviously an intersection between policy and politics, and so it feels to me that this issue around clean energy was made a political issue at different points, and one of the narratives out there was that it was the province of the elite. And so only wealthy people were going to be able to ever afford an electric car or solar panels on their rooftop, and so that became sort of the political pushback and slowed progress to some extent. One other sort of parenthetical is I've got Dan and David here. So it's great, to do policy. We did a lot of policy when I was governor, but nature didn't always cooperate. We signed the 20% renewable energy bill in a wind farm, and the wind didn't blow. Like the wind blew every other frickin' day of the year and did not blow that day. And then we went out to like Watkins with that solar tech. We were establishing this big campus that Excel and INREL were doing together, and the sun didn't shine. It was just like, the gods were conspiring against me. So, David, I want to go back to this issue about, businesses looking at this change. They have some preference, and I think Rose used the language, exiting the system. That has to make a CEO of a major utility pretty nervous, especially because of the pace of change.
Yeah, I'm getting more and more nervous just listening to her. So, no, in all seriousness, that's one way to get there, but I think there are so many other paths we can take, and I'm proud of the steps we're taking in Colorado, and not just this year or last year, but if you look back, we've grown our distributed solar programs to put them together with solar community gardens, and it's like 125 megawatts a year of growth. I mean, when we add 700 megawatts of grid-scale solar under this new plan, it'll just catch up with the distributed solar that's being added as we go along. A brand new offering was created last year, and the solar project's being built now. We call it Renewable Connect, but it's low-cost, grid-scale solar. And I think the commission, the parties that helped develop this plan, did a wonderful job of making sure that there is absolutely no cross-subsidy or cost shift to any other customers. The customer pays for the solar out of the project, whatever that cost is, and then they get full credit for all the marginal avoided costs on the system. It's called Renewable Connect. I think it's a great product. When and how we grow it, we need to respond to our customers. But I think there's other options like that. I think there are ways for us to do this. I can tell you that not everyone wants to do it. I don't think every customer wants to. Not every city wants to. But I think that there are ways to deal with, it's complex, but we can deal with it and offer choices to customers. We have a whole bunch of different renewable energy options, ranging from real simple wind source, we'll add more wind than the RECs we need, to more complicated products with longer term contracts. So I think there are ways to do it very well within the regulated model. I like that a lot better than the vote, I really do.
I'm sure you do. However, in fairness, within the bounds of a regulated environment, you do have some flexibility. There are some utilities, I think Kathy from Berkshire, who specifically referenced the fact that they're responding to customer needs and expectations, that they have a non-regulated subsidiary that allows them some flexibility, particularly as they pursue their wind goal. And so to the extent that our regulatory regimes need to change or need to embrace change or to be more nimble, there are many things that you can do on a more creative basis, and you've described a couple of them. So just embracing that philosophy, I think, is definitely a step forward. But I'm not sure it's going to be enough.
Can I add to that?
Yep.
So I think the one other thing that I'm going to have to try to win this debate. I think the one other aspect to the approach we're taking is the social justice, the equity of this, not across the globe, not across the country, but within our service territory. And we're having some very interesting conversations with communities. If we can add the lowest cost renewables, avoid this cross-subsidy, make sure that we're bringing this in. I mean, if we get our Colorado system to 55% with this next plan, if we can do that, and then take another 10%, we're having interesting conversations with cities and customers who up to this point have said, I'm going to be 50% or 100% renewable or get a certain carbon reduction, and they feel like they have to start from scratch. And now they're talking to us about, if you'll account for your RECs, if you'll assure us that you're not selling this, that you're not double counting, we think it makes a lot of sense to start with your system mix. So we can actually do community projects in a city to take them from 60% to 100%, or let them do their own, or with individual large customers. But all of the citizens of Denver will get the benefit of the higher penetration of renewables. And I think we can do it at a very low cost. I don't know that we can do it that much cheaper than the gaming industry, like your large company, but smaller customers need a vehicle to do this, and I think we can.
So, Dan, because of your connection to the Jobs family, you really are sort of tapped into Apple. They're among a group of fairly big technological companies that have huge data centers, that have huge energy needs. And how much are they going to impact? I mean, we talked about Microsoft exiting the system. How much are they impacting sort of the energy portfolio of the future just because they want something different than some other sort of legacy business?
Yeah, I think what you're saying, now that I spend a significant amount of time in Silicon Valley, what I detect there is it's a very different environment than anything that I've been accustomed to in the past. I taught at Stanford. I taught a class called the Energy Transformation Collaborative, and every student wants to do a startup. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, the amount of innovation that's occurring, and what I'm finding is that philanthropy is actually playing a fairly significant role in seeding those new companies. And so there's, we get into Series A, Series B kind of, I call it later stage, because these companies come with revenue products already in place, and they come with, essentially $50 to $100 million of previous investment before they come to the big foundations. What I'm seeing is that there is a tremendous amount of effort, certainly in the IT industry, and servers are a big piece of that. The technology's already changed. In fact, we helped pioneer some of that here in NREL with our new high-performance computer that ultimately was put together by HP with liquid cooling, which is something that at room temperature, which is something that most of the data centers are going to now. Data centers are going to be a huge fraction of our energy consumption going forward, and that's not just in the U.S., that's globally. And so many of those manufacturers are saying, we want 100% green in terms of our power consumption. And with the data center, you can actually locate it wherever you want. So they're looking for places where you've got great resources and easy infrastructure to adopt, and that's creating jobs locally in those communities. So they are already starting to influence how communities see that particular corporate entity, if you will, and to make it attractive for them to come here, for instance, or go wherever they go. And Apple is no different. I'm on a board in Singapore, and in fact, they're huge in terms of net zero energy and also net zero energy development of their facilities in those locations so that they're generating as much renewable energy as they consume on an annual basis.
So I'm going to ask you another question, Dan, and then kind of bring it down the line to have other people think about it, especially I know Nevada has a big play here. Energy storage. So we've talked a little bit about that as part of the transition, as part of the disruption, and I suspect, all of you have some view about that because Rose, they have the Gigafactory, and then David, it could disrupt your business model or the industry's business model. How much do you think that plays in the transition, Dan, and what's the pace of our adoption of new energy storage technology that can be a disruptor?
Let me first acknowledge that energy storage, especially big power energy storage, can be a game changer. No question about that. It is still not yet at the point where I think it can compete effectively with the incumbent types of other technologies that you could do to avoid having storage. So there is R&D to be done there. I'm not a huge fan, I've said this many, many times, of electrochemistry. I mean, I used to run a battery program at Sandia Labs for weapons systems, and that was in the 90s, and we just haven't made a lot of progress in that. Lithium ion is wonderful, and it's great. Still not at the cost point you need to have it for large storage. And it's, price points for electric vehicles are even tough. I mean, if you go talk to auto manufacturers, that's what they'll tell you. Now that notwithstanding, and I talked to Elon Musk on occasion and had many meetings with him regarding storage, there is, I think an opportunity for those costs to come down. And I think over time they will, but it's slow. And so I think in the interim, what do you do is kind of the question that people have to grapple with. And I consult for Google and a couple of other companies who are very active in this area. And there, I can tell you, without disclosing anything proprietary, there's a tremendous number of options for new energy storage that are yet in the development stage that I think we will see over the course of the next few years. Now, the adoption of those, obviously, integration into the incumbent system takes time. And so it's not going to be an overnight thing, but I think looking back 20 years from now, we will see that there will be at one point an inflection point on storage, and it'll be a game changer in terms of how quickly things move from there.
Yep, absolutely agree. Going back to this notion of where we were and where we are now, the intermittency of solar and other renewables was always a challenge. Now we're talking about storing and finding a way to eliminate that barrier. In Nevada, we had a really interesting, I think Chairman Reynolds mentioned this, a really interesting legislative session, and full disclosure, what I do for a living is I'm a lobbyist. We had 11 bills, clean energy bills, that the legislature passed to include a bill around storage. He mentioned the electric vehicles, and we also had a very aggressive renewable portfolio standard increase. The conversation around storage, to use a term, electrified the policymakers. They were so excited because we were addressing an aspect beyond the pricing and the economics, which is always the first thing that we discuss, of our ability to advance these technologies that was really going to be, as you say, Dan, a game changer. So you're seeing policymakers, I think, place more emphasis on technology. And of course, as the winner of the Gigafactory, finding a way to leverage that is of extreme interest to our policymakers in Nevada as well.
So David, how does the utility industry look at energy storage as a positive or as something that's going to be a disruptor that could wind up being a negative to your business model?
Well, I think it depends on how companies approach it. It's definitely a game changer. It's a question of when. It's economic in Hawaii. If you got 30-cent rates, it's already economic. It's close in California. In different applications, it's actually economic. Tucson Electric Power contracted for close to $45 a megawatt hour for a combined large-scale solar and battery project with, I think, 2 hours of storage. So it pushes the cost of the production up, but it also lets it cover our peak, gives you some flexibility, provides some value. I think there's a chance we may, in the process we're going through, that we may have a storage proposal that's economic, with solar or otherwise. We'll have to see. I think the most important thing we need to do, and it'll be done different in different markets, in a full RTO with ancillary services versus a market like we operate in Colorado now. There are so many value streams that storage can provide. And it's important, especially in a low-cost energy market like we're in the middle of the country, to capture those. So whether the utility owns some of the batteries or we're sending price signals, I'd like to pay a customer. If you're going to buy a Powerwall, I'll give you $200 a month, or $200 a year, sorry, that's too much. I'll give you an extra $200 a year, like I do for Saver Switch, if you'll let me operate it 6 times during the year to help cover a contingency event, or to load follow, to regulate when we have a wind icing event, things like that. So there are about 8 different major value streams for storage, and I think it's important that we build the capability to capture multiple values.
What's really interesting about that, David, is so this prior panel, Pat Cummins, who sat here, Patrick, so he did a whole analysis on how much coal is being used to load follow. And this idea about coal being a base load 24/7, but if you look over the last 20 years, we've increased the amount of coal, and to load follow means used for when you need capacity and you don't have enough. And if you actually do a variety of things using demand-side management to increase load following, that's going to make it even more difficult to continue to operate coal-fired plants. And that it's just such an interesting sort of part of this conversation. So we have about 20 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question and start thinking of your questions. David, you were here for Amory Lovins and then sat next to him at dinner last night, and one of the things that he said is he thought big centralized distribution grids were a thing of the past and kind of go away. And I think you have a different viewpoint, and so I'd like your viewpoint. And then again, Rose and Dan, same question. We'll go pretty quickly here and then open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I appreciated that Amory asked me last night, right off the bat. He said, "Is there anything I said that you would correct or that you have a different viewpoint on?" And I said, "Sit down, we need to talk." No, he's amazing. His foresight and his knowledge is amazing. I don't agree that, I think I understood him say that the grid will become obsolete, that it becomes a stranded cost at some point, or a stranded asset, at least as we know it today. And I don't think that's the case. I think it has to change. I mean, we're investing significantly in the grid to address the cybersecurity issues, to create the kind of visibility and automation to accommodate more distributed generation. It wasn't designed for this, so we have to make sure it'll work that way, and that we can add much more penetration of storage and customer solar and so on. We got steel mills, we have smelters, we have mines, we have massively intensive loads in the core cities. You can do the math. I wish I had it with me, but the amount of solar needed to power the buildings in downtown Denver would cover most of the metropolitan area. So at some point, I think you still need the grid. It's going to be operated differently. And you look at how much renewable energy in our country is coming from wind. It's hard for me to envision wind becoming a wonderful distributed resource. I think it will continue to exist at a utility scale. I know I don't want one in my backyard. They're going to be out on the plains in the rural parts of the state where the wind resource is great. So,
Rose?
I just met David. He's going to hate me. I do think that the grid is on the path to being obsolete, or maybe the way you framed it, which is that as we know the grid, it's going to change in a very dramatic way. So I've known Amory for a long time as a brand new commissioner. He was my first expert witness. And I can tell you, bringing him into the hearing room changed the dynamic of everything that we discussed. But that said, I see shrinkage, maybe, of the grid. Transmission will continue to be an important issue. The more we talk about a regionalization of how we deal with power, I see the way that the grid has functioned becoming antiquated / obsolete. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I absolutely agree with you. just like I don't think at this point that we can eliminate other sources of energy in the fuel mix. But if you think about the decline that we've just seen in the last decade, I'm not the math person here, but it is significant. And I think we need to prepare for it.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in on this one as well. It's certainly a debate for the ages, and you know, like Yogi Berra likes to say, or used to say, it's dangerous to make predictions about especially about the future. And I think in this case, it's a little foolhardy, but I'll throw caution to the wind and say I agree with Rose. First of all, I don't think we eliminate the grid. I think it will be very different, and it, you know, like my other business, the regulated insurance company, where what you do is you segment the market, you segment the products and services that you provide, and you price them accordingly. It's a little bit what David said earlier. You know, you've got value streams for storage. You've got value streams for all kinds of electric products and services. And so the utility of the future, I think, will be very different and it'll be driven by market forces. The markets will decide and tell us and dictate to us where we can squeeze inefficiencies out of the system. The system that we previously kind of have had for the last 100 years or so was not very intelligent, and in fact, in terms of asset utilization, it was very, very low. I mean, it was, you know, less than 50% asset utilization. Not many businesses run efficiently and economically at that asset ratio. So I think it'll be very different, and you will accommodate intermittent resources with all kinds of things, not just storage, but larger balancing areas, cooperation among states. You know, a variety of things that, and consumers will be part of that equation. As a consumer, I'd like to have some choice about when to put, you know, energy back into the grid and get paid for it. And David can help me figure out when that is most economical for me to do. So I think technology, IT, and the evolution of markets will dictate a different way in which we do things.
Just listening to the three of you, I actually don't disagree. I think you're saying something pretty close to the same. It may be obsolete if we think about the big centralized generation grid of today with this technology, but that it's going to be managed differently. There's still going to be centralized generation. The one thing I would say is there are these projects sort of around the country that are looking at decentralizing the grid, in part because of resiliency and the need for added resiliency, and extreme weather effects seem to enhance that, or that project, not enhance it, but accelerate the development of microgrids and mini-grids. With that, I'm going to see if there are any questions from the audience for the Capstone Panel. You see it? Yes, sir.
This is a question for Dan. What is the level of efficiency of photovoltaics today, and where do you think it's going?
So that graph that Morgan talked about in the last session, the so-called PV curve, you know, the workhorse technologies are in the low 20% of sunlight falling on the surface being converted to electricity. So somewhere between 20 and 25% are kind of what I'm going to call the commercial technologies of today. I see, so efficiency I think is really important, especially because it allows you to reduce the amount of area that you need in order to generate a certain amount of electricity. But I think it's really more about cost, and it really is more about what type of service can a PV device actually offer. I mean, the thing that excites me about photovoltaics is not that we're going to get to 50%, which I think we can, for high efficiency multi-junction technologies that can be used for space and whatnot because they're very expensive. But the manufacturing processes that allow you to spray paint these things like newspaper, and to do this on flexible surfaces that you can coat, you know, the outside of buildings with. I mean, that's really where the opportunity space is, and so those might be lower efficiency, but in terms of cost per kilowatt hour, they're going to give you some very, very good functionality at a very low cost. So I think that's where the technology will go, and it's a good metric to figure out how much of the sunlight incident on a particular surface can you convert to electricity, but it's really about what does that cost you, and at what cost over time. And I think there is tremendous opportunity still left in terms of photovoltaic
technology development to get us to those kind of outcomes.
I know this isn't in response to that question, but one of the really interesting things, although our thesis for this conference has been about the power of states and cities and corporations to move sort of this clean energy agenda. There was an announcement today coming out of the federal government. The president will be the final decider on the amount of the tariff that will be placed on solar panels, if there's a tariff placed at all, but there was a recommendation today. And there are a lot of people inside the solar industry, so not the manufacturing part of it, but the folks who are part of installing utility scale, residential scale, commercial scale solar, who are very afraid that that tariff is going to cause the solar industry to have a very difficult path forward in the near term. So just pay attention to that tariff case, because all this that we've seen and this discussion we've had about the build out of solar and the downward shift in price could be impacted in a very different and I would say negative way by a significant tariff. Tom, do you have questions? Do you have a...
Yeah, I have a quick question for you. Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates that within about 20 years, half of new car sales will be EVs. In the VW settlement, they're talking about installing fast charging infrastructure that's looking at anywhere from 350 kilowatts to 450 kilowatts, which today fast charging is about 30 to 50. And so this seems like a large infrastructure investment, and as Chairman Ackerman was talking today, the planning horizon is about 40 years. How are utilities looking at this? Clearly it's a new load, but it's also a big challenge in terms of infrastructure investment.
So I think the impact, we definitely are trying to plan for it. There's a lot of scenarios in terms of the rate of growth and the penetration. I think the prior panel talked about leapfrogging and whether something like that's going to occur. Frankly, it's likely to just help offset the reduction in energy sales that are, what our customers need in the first place. We grow right now 1.5% customers every year, but our sales are declining or flat. If every residence that we serve had an electric vehicle, one, and used it as a commuter vehicle, it would increase our residential, I think it would increase our total sales like 20%. So if that occurred over 20, 25 years, it's probably going to keep us close to, it's basically going to offset all the efficiencies that are occurring through our programs and through customers' initiatives.
But if it occurred over 10 years, that's a much better picture.
Now you're talking.
Well, you heard somebody say today, Beijing and Paris have both said they're going to all electric vehicles by 2030. Can they accomplish that? I have no idea. But it seems like there are enough people out there talking about rapid adoption of electric vehicles that the auto manufacturers are beginning to pay more attention to it, and the prices come down like somebody else talked about. Was it? I forget who talked about that in this conference. But EVs coming down because battery costs come down.
Right.
You might see a 10, 13-year window where you have that kind of growth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we think is most important is to move toward pricing programs. Customers shouldn't have to put a separate meter in to get a different rate. We need, part of our advanced grid work will allow us to provide the kind of pricing. We'll have marginal energy prices at night with 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts of wind on the Colorado system that will be close to zero. So we should be able to provide the right incentives to help people charge those vehicles at night, and then eventually you get to the point where it's grid to battery, vehicle to grid, demand response, all that.
Rose, do you want to weigh in on this, the EV?
I just see, from a consumer standpoint, if the automobile industry can actually meet what they say that they can, and the pricing continues to be competitive, I see this as the next wave of activity in this space.
Dan?
Yeah, that's a interesting and I think provocative question because you would do, if you knew for sure where you're going, then you would do some things differently. Again, I sit on this board of a big auto insurance company, and I mean, what we talk about at the board meeting is about AI, not about electric vehicles, and it's primarily because as cars get more efficient and greater autonomy, then you have less things to insure, if you will. It's still more expensive, but there are less things to insure. So by that same amount of time, the insurance companies are going to lose about 40% of their auto revenues in terms of insurance. So they're looking at what else might we provide in terms of new opportunities to essentially provide services to customers and clients. So it's changing that industry. But the fact is, I think those are optimistic projections by Bloomberg. I would be the first to admit that because it's going to depend on the cost of batteries. And so far, I mean, I can't tell you how many ventures I've looked at for alternatives to lithium ion, because everyone sees there are limitations that are not too far away that only new chemistries can overcome. So from a technology standpoint, I think there are still some opportunities that are kind of breakthrough-like that could change the equation, and then I would agree with Bloomberg. But until I see those more definitively, I'd be a little skeptical that is actually going to happen.
So I think what they referenced, though, Dan, is that graph that the Department of Energy published a year ago, and it showed, wind coming down, solar, utility scale solar. Then the next curve, which was second to biggest in terms of a downward turn in pricing, was energy storage, and then the final one was LEDs. So I think people are looking at that curve and having great confidence that battery technology is getting cheaper, and you seem to be disagreeing with that.
Well, I think if I just focus on lithium-ion or electrochemistry, I think something different has to happen. Now, as I mentioned, there are some investments being made in the private sector, and many of them through corporations that are not visible to the government. Now, I do believe that the government's expecting that those are going to happen, but I mean, again, I've just watched 40 years worth of electrochemistry, and I'm still skeptical. Yeah.
Thank you. Question, Francis Concilia, a Public Utility Commissioner for Colorado.
David's got so many cases pending on our docket, it would be an ex parte contact, so I can't ask him anything. But the Colorado Commission is going to do an EV seminar, informational meeting on December 8th. My question is for Rose. I go to these conferences and everybody talks about choice and markets, and one of the things I'm concerned about is energy fairness for poor people, for the rural communities, and markets almost always go to where they can cherry pick and get the best profit. How can the grid, how can electricity, how can a regulator like myself make sure that everybody's going to have access to it? That last 50 miles in Montrose, in Delta, is competition really going to take care of that?
I think a fair question, and one that is really a challenge. One of the things that Governor Sandoval did in advance of the second vote was to establish a committee to review a range of issues. And one of the issues that this committee is looking at, and they actually have a subgroup to focus on, is the issue of equity and ratepayer or consumer impacts. And so the thought is that we try to bring in some of the best minds to understand the opportunities for best practices to ensure that in this new frontier, folks aren't left behind. If we leave it without any attention, without any debate, then the scenario that you describe is inevitable. So I think the first step is to make sure that it's a part of the conversation. To ignore it means that we will have individuals who will be further disadvantaged. But I think that there are some promising approaches that can be discussed within the regulatory environment that will ensure that those voices are heard.
Thanks. Tom, the gentleman behind you right there, he has a question.
Hi, I'm, for full disclosure, I'm part of the utility business, so I just wanted to say a couple things. Just one is that I heard that the grid needs to change. I think that was a consensus up there. The thing that shocks me a little bit is that when the utilities come to regulators to change their business model, they may want to change their net metering policy or do some different things. They're told, no, you're killing the industry, you're doing this, you can't recover costs, you can't. And so they're basically saying the utility of the future needs to be different, but we're not going to let you do it. And the other point I want to make is I think solar is a success story, a gigantic success story, and especially in the state of Colorado. It's got a lot of different legs. It's got policy that Governor Ritter started many years ago. It's got technology that NREL developed. It's got federal tax credits. It's got rebates. But you know what I think one of the biggest things that's the part of the solar success story is the connection to the grid. That convenience of being able to go grid-tied solar. I can be watching a television program and I don't even know who's supplying the energy. There's no blinks. There's no switches that I have to do. Americans want that convenience, and that grid provides it to them. And I think the grid is as part of that success story as anything that's been up here. And I can't believe that we're going to toss the grid into the trash because it doesn't work. Xcel Energy's got less than a $10 a month service charge. That means for $120 a year, these people connect to the grid. Their renewable energy can turn their meter forwards and backwards. They can watch television at night. They can turn on their oven, their air conditioner. They can do everything because they're connected to the grid. Now try to do that with a generator or a battery or anything else that you come up with, and do it for less than $120 a year. I don't know why we have to throw the grid away. I agree with David. It needs to change, needs to get better, needs to be more flexible. But I think this is the backbone of the success of where we're going. Not to eliminate it, but at the backbone of the success.
So we had a rule of thumb when I was governor. If somebody didn't ask a question, don't answer it. So I'm not going to throw that to the panel, and particularly the comment about regulators, because I'll say this. Regulators across the country function differently. In some states, it's much different than other places. Some places where it's appointed by governors, there's a very different commission than you might get in places where it is elected. And even among elected commissions, Montana, a very, very conservative state. But when we were working the Clean Power Plan, one of the very conservative members of the Montana Commission probably understood transition about as well as any commissioner across the country. So anyway, it's we shouldn't paint with too broad a brush. We are now out of time. And so I want you to put your hands together. First of all, let me just say a couple things before you clap. I really do appreciate that you're here. This was a great discussion by exceptional panelists, but it wouldn't have been all that great if you hadn't decided to stay with us till the very end. So I said at the beginning, but I say it again at the end. Now give them a big round of applause because they were exceptional. Thank you.